I would just like to welcome you all here today and thank everyone for coming. My name is Sarah Stotts, and this semester I am interning with Sue Nagelkirk at the UW Extension office. I'm currently attending UW Stout Online and will be graduating in December with a bachelor's degree in Human Development and Family Studies. Along with that, I also work here at the Sauk County Jail for the last about 9.5 years. So actually this topic is something that I care deeply about. I think the families are important. It's hard when you work in the jail and you have certain restrictions, but you have to also recognize that the families are struggling too. So today, before we get started, I just want to remind everybody to make sure you get signed in outside the front door there, door behind you, I guess. And there's cookies and lemonade if you want to help yourself. And if anyone needs to use the restroom, they're towards the elevator and to the left. So I'm going to hand it off now to Sue Nagelkirk for introduction.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you again for coming here today. You know, when I asked Dr. Poehlmann to come and talk to us today, I honestly thought she would have to say, sorry, Sue, because my report to the National Institutes of Health is due in November.
In a week.
I have a lot of things to do. So I feel like we are so lucky to have Dr. Poehlmann-Tynan with us today. She does research to understand the development and relationships of infants and young children who experience risk. And it may be biological, like an early birth, or in some cases, a social risk, and maybe an incarcerated parent. She strives to promote resilience processes and optimize individual and family well-being. Her research with children of incarcerated parents was funded by the National Institute of Health and the Department of Health and Human Services. And she also serves as a Sesame Street advisor for Little Children, Big Challenge, Incarceration. And I hope you got a copy of that as you came in. So let us give a nice warm Sauk County welcome to Dr. Poehlmann-Tynan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very thankful for Sue and UW Extension office and the county jail that I worked with for the last few years for having me here. And originally I was just going to give you the findings from the study that I'm about to wrap up, but then what I realized when I came here is that probably the study findings would mean more if you knew more about the background of this issue, and so I thought I would just sort of back up and give you a little bit more general information before I went into study details. And because I'm just at UW-Madison, I'm more than happy to give you more information, come back, whatever you need. But thank you so much. I'm happy to be here in beautiful Sauk County. So one of the things that we do when we study children with incarcerated parents is we do look at real children. And I'll just show you a couple of drawings when we ask the little kids in the study to draw a picture of their family. So this occurred during a visit at the jail. And so the little child who is 5 drew mom, dad, self. This is the picture that the same child drew at home. That was mom and child, happy and smiling. But this is another kind of picture that we get, 5-year-old, a kid who's just barely hanging on. And so I think it's important to note that, it's not all roses, but it can be positive. This is another one, oh no, my mom and dad are in jail. And I think it's really, that's a little bit older child, so they can, write and stuff. But I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about the background, about what we know about children with incarcerated parents, some issues to do with visitation, and some policy and practice issues. And I know I have to stop at noon. I could probably talk about this for like 40 hours, so please bear with me. I'll skip over a few of these slides. But we know now that because we've been in an era of mass incarceration in the United States for a couple of decades now, that there are millions of children who have a parent in jail or prison. Just last year, there were 11.7 million admissions to jail across the United States. Sometimes, you know, it was the same person more than once. But about half, or a little more than half, of inmates have children. So you can just imagine the number of children that are affected by having a parent in jail, not to mention prison. As you also know, there are many, many racial disparities in arrest, conviction, incarceration, and there are now scholars who are doing some analyses to show that they think some of these disparities in incarceration and its negative sequelae for families is also partially responsible for racial disparities we see in education, homelessness, infant mortality, and behavior problems. So it's important to keep in mind. I know in Sauk County, you know, it's maybe a little bit less diverse than the places that I give talks to, but it's definitely an issue affecting many people, but disproportionately African American and Native American and Hispanic people. So I already said that. This is the graph of the state and federal prison populations through 2013 from 1978, and as you can see, there's this very steady rise. And last year was the first year that there was a decrease in the federal prison population in 30 years. And there was a slight dip in the state prison population, but that mostly reflects a dip in men. The number of incarcerated women continues to rise at a faster rate than incarcerated men. So that is becoming a really pronounced problem. So I just gave a talk in Ohio, so I had their stats up. So sometimes when we think of corrections and incarceration, we don't really think of the kids attached to them. They've been invisible for a really long time, but I think it's absolutely essential that we think of them, because during an arrest, children might be present. And in the study that we just finished collecting data on in Racine County, Dane County, and Sauk County, we found that 25% of the children between the ages of 2 and 6 years old witnessed the arrest of their parent. And many places do not have law enforcement protocols that are special for when children are present. And now at the federal level, there is a law enforcement protocol, and there's a webinar to train law enforcement professionals. And the goal of the Obama administration, at least, is to make sure that every community trains their police officers so that they can engage in arrest protocols that are appropriate when children are present, because that kind of trauma can really stay with kids. Other problems involve, when a parent is incarcerated, involve separation from a parent. That's sort of given. But even when a parent wasn't living in the household with the child, there are still issues. For example, dads who are incarcerated, most of them provided the primary financial support for their families, even if they weren't living with the families. Most incarcerated moms have been living with the children. For dads, it's maybe about 40%, 50%. So when a parent is incarcerated, children may also have to move. They may have to change schools. Some people claim that even with all that, you know, economic challenges, moving, changes in caregivers, that really the biggest problem is social stigma. And this has to do especially when the parent has committed a felony, because the parent oftentimes loses a lot of their rights to housing, to vote, to be on certain work sites. They have about a 40% reduction in their lifetime earnings. It's pretty significant and has effects on the children. And the children themselves often feel stigma. There's a myth that's on the internet, on TV, everywhere I look, that says that children with incarcerated parents are 5 to 7 times more likely to end up in prison, or that 70% of them end up in prison. And those are just not true. They don't have any empirical basis. But what is true is they are about twice as likely as other kids to have problems. And that's still a lot, but it's not like inevitable. There are plenty of kids with incarcerated parents that don't end up incarcerated themselves. Another issue for these children has to do with the visiting environments. If they want to stay in touch with their parents, a lot of times that they end up in visiting environments that really aren't meant for children at all. because, you know, in this era of mass incarceration, people are thinking of, you know, public safety, they're thinking of security issues, they're not thinking of the family members of the incarcerated individuals. And so a lot of times children have to wait a long time in security lines, go through metal detectors, be frisked, see their parents behind plexiglass or just through video monitors with no privacy whatsoever, so that they can also observe the visits of everybody next to them. And my research group has just finished the only study in the United States where we actually watched children during visitation with their parents, including here in Sauk County. And what we found is that children spend more than half the time watching the visits of other people when there is no privacy. And so if the person next to them is talking about something like murder or whatever, they just get exposed to it. And in Racine County, where they also rely on video visitation in addition to plexiglass visitation, the video visitation occurs in the inmate's cell block. So the children can see into the cell block through the video monitors. So I think sometimes people talk about those kind of visiting environments aren't always great for children, and I'll talk about that more later, what we kind of recommend as alternatives. And then there's, of course, challenges associated with reunification, reentry, and things like that, and we really don't even know the complexities about that, but they are challenging. So I also just wanted to note that it's not just children who are affected. Of course, the people who care for the children are affected as well. And when moms go to prison, the grandparents are more likely to care for the children than anybody else. About 20%, 25% dads, and about 25%, 30% child foster care, child welfare. But more often than not, it's a grandparent. Now, when a father is incarcerated, it's like 90-some% of the time children stay with their moms. Typically, the incarcerated parents, you know, have low education, they've lived in poverty, they have mental health problems, history of substance abuse, etc. And just remember, that's the context of risk for these kids. So it's not like the incarceration of the parent is like, comes along just as this big bang surprise. A lot of times it's in the context of other risks, but it does create additional problems for kids who are already at high risk. And the kids of incarcerated parents are more likely than their peers to exhibit a host of problems, including externalizing behavior problems, which are like acting out, anger, impulsivity, sometimes aggression. They're also more likely to show anxiety, depression, school-related problems, especially truancy, academic failure, lower cognitive skills. In fact, in the sample that we just finished collecting data on, we found that there were about 5 times the rate of cognitive delays in the kids than you would expect compared to the normal population, and the majority of them were living in not just poverty, but what we call extreme poverty. They also are more likely to engage in health risk behaviors as adolescents, more likely to you know, use drugs and things like that. Oh, thank you. You're sweet. And more likely to experience multiple risk factors. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the ACEs data set, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, but the Center for Disease Control did a survey of people who had experienced trauma as a young person, including maltreatment, living with a person who became incarcerated, experiencing other things like witnessing violence. And what they found is that the people who had experienced adverse childhood events were more likely to have health problems later in their life, and they were also more likely to engage in problematic health behaviors. So the really shocking thing that they found is living with a person who ended up incarcerated, most of the time a parent, they were about 4 times more likely to have multiple risk factors and adverse childhood experiences in their life. So they were at the highest category for health problems and early death. So all that's pretty negative, right? And as I mentioned, these are things to be really concerned about. And I give talks all over the country. I've been at the White House twice in the past year and a half. This is a national problem. And it's serious, but I would also like to emphasize that the outcomes for these kids are not determined. It's not like just because someone has an incarcerated parent that they're going to end up with really negative life chances. what I study is resilience or positive development in the context of risk. And what we found over the past 15 years of studying this issue is that when the children have positive relationships with their caregivers and positive, stable, stimulating home environments, they're not moved from place to place, people read to them, they talk to them, they're safe. And when they have positive contact with incarcerated parents, they're way more likely to do well in multiple domains of development. And I'll talk more about what that kind of positive contact means, but I also want to emphasize the really important role of caregivers. And they're often invisible, they're often not given very much support. Sometimes when they come into visiting situations, people don't treat them very well because they know they have a loved one who's incarcerated, and that kind of adds to their social stigma. But they're really critical for the well-being of these kids. So I'll tell you just a little bit more about visitation, and then I want to make sure that I have time for you to ask questions, so I'm going to kind of go fast, but I'm happy to go back to anything you need me to go back to. So with my colleague in the law school, we looked at visitation in Wisconsin Department of Corrections facilities, and we could only collect the data at half of the adult male corrections, but there were 48,000 visits from children in a one-year period, and that's more than 131 children walking into Wisconsin State Prison visiting rooms per day, if you divide that out, per day of visitation. We also know that even more people visit their loved ones in jail because the jails are closer to them. And so I think, we spend a lot of time talking about rehabilitation and family visitation and stuff for people in state prison, but I also think in the jail settings end up being really critical because kids are actually more likely to walk into a jail visiting room than a state prison. There are some issues with visiting, and a lot of them have to do with the structural factors that may not be conducive. How does a family find out about how to visit? Do they have to have an original copy of the child's birth certificate, or they get turned away, or what are the rules and procedures that might be barriers to positive contact? But also, we found in our study that when the incarcerated parent and the child's caregiver have a negative relationship with each other, the child is just less likely not to come at all. And so children sometimes lose out on that opportunity to get to know their incarcerated parent. Also, what we find, it's kind of shocking, but because we're in prison and jail waiting rooms all the time, and what we find is that even when families bring kids into the visitation environment, a lot of times they haven't told their child anything about where the incarcerated parent is. So like the kid, here they walk into, it looks like an office building, it's not that intimidating. There isn't like barbed wire, and they don't have to go through security because it's video, etc. But in most places that's not the case. They would notice that something's really different about this environment, and if no one tells them where they're going, it's kind of weird, and then they feel like they can't talk about it. So some families don't talk about the incarceration of their loved one because they think they're protecting the child from social stigma. Or they make up a story like the parent is on vacation, they're at work, etc., because they want to protect the child. Well, what we found is just the opposite. When families make up a story or don't talk about it at all, the children start feeling really insecure in that it's so bad that they can't talk about it. When families simply and honestly talk to children in a developmentally appropriate manner and tell the truth, they build trust in the child, and they help insulate the child against social stigma that is going to happen in society. And the child can feel like, oh, it's not so bad, my family can talk to me about this, and they don't have to worry so much. So it's sort of paradoxical, but if you read through the Sesame Street materials, they're a very research-based organization, and they have great suggestions in their caregiver guide for how to talk to young children whose parents are incarcerated. It's available in both English and Spanish, and they use words that, researchers, I was the only research advisor, but me and other people who have worked in this field for like 30 years have told them to write. So you say things like, if a kid says, well, why are they in jail? They're not saying, what crime did they commit? They just want to know how a person gets in jail. So you would say things, well, they broke a law. A law is like a grown-up rule, and it's a really big deal if you break a law. So anyway, if you read through those materials, they give you great suggestions on how to talk to young kids about the incarceration of a parent that are sensitive and supportive of the child and help actually reduce social stigma. So this is just tells you a little bit about the study that we're just wrapping up right now. And so Sauk is one of the 3 Wisconsin counties that we worked with, and I'm very grateful to the Sheriff's Department for supporting this work. We also looked at Dane and Racine, and we have 2 counties in Minnesota. And in total, we probably have more like 150 children because we added the Minnesota sites. But as part of the protocol, we talk to the incarcerated parents, we do interviews, we do home visits with the children, and then we also observe the visits, and we observe face-to-face, closed-circuit TV or video, and plexiglass visits. And that's oftentimes what you see, kids climbing up on the shelves. Most plexiglass visitation booths have a little shelf, but only one person can talk to the parent at a time, and so kids oftentimes have to wait their turn, and that's why they watch other people's visits. They sometimes look like that sometimes the kids are just sitting in rows with their families and taking turns. This is actually Racine County, where you can see, I don't know if you can see the guy in orange, but he's in his cell block, and you can see right behind him the rest of the cell block. And this is what I would consider a little bit more child-friendly visiting space. You can see there's like a low table and some books and toys, so parents can read to their children and play with their children during a visit, not just sit in a booth. Really child-friendly visitation involves things like allowing physical contact between children and their parents, and most of the places that have done that have found that there's no real safety risk as long as you're making sure that you're working with the lower risk inmates, and it's better for kids. So one of the things that we found is that of all the children that we observed, they pretty much all visually engaged with their parent. They were all looking at them. They all either said something loving or smiled. Almost all of them verbally engaged with the parent, listened, talked, said loving things. You know, if it was through plexiglass, sometimes they did these little games through the glass. If it was video or face-to-face, they said things like, "I love you." And then, you know, sometimes they looked away or they needed a break, and that's what we call, quote, avoidance. And some at some point appeared fearful or sad. But they really relied on support from their caregivers during that process, and they stayed in close proximity and wanted to sit on their lap or hold their hand. And so we know the caregiver plays a really critical role during visitation as well. We also compared different types of visits because there's been a lot of criticism in the scholarly literature about, quote, allowing children to go to plexiglass visits because they can't touch a parent. But we found that there weren't a whole lot of differences when we rated children's actual behavior. And as I mentioned, we're the only people in the country to actually do this. And we did find that the kids were just a little bit more likely to show sadness and confusion during plexiglass visits than video visits, but the other behaviors didn't differ. We did find a difference between how the kids behave in the jail and at home. As you can imagine, kids engage in a little bit more behavioral dysregulation at the jail, where they're a little bit busier, they have a little bit more trouble regulating their emotions. But that, I think, would be expected. I think if we had rated the adults, that would be true for them too. It's a stressful situation for many people. Here is a graph of what we found in our study about what families tell young children. And you can see that it's about 40% of people give simple and honest explanations for the parent being incarcerated. They just say something like, "Oh, your parent's in jail." Some of them say what we call a distortion, where they tell a story. You know, that's not true. Some of them tell really developmentally appropriate things, like they might say, okay, you know, to like a 2-year-old, your daddy's in like a really big long time out, you know, just so the kid would have some kind of general conception of it. And then about 14% were saying nothing. And what we found is that the younger a child was, the more likely the family was to tell like a story or nothing, because they didn't really think that children could understand. But in our work, what we often hear from the children directly is that they say, you know, "Oh yeah, I know, my dad's in jail, but they don't think I know, or I'm the only one who knows that my dad's in jail. And so they think that, you know, they have the inside scoop, because little children have big ears. They hear things, you know, they know what's going on. They often hear behind closed doors. And I've talked to enough children to know that they find out eventually, and you know, families really need to cultivate trust, and they can do that by telling the truth. So I do have some recommendations that are, you know, based on the work I've done here and other places. I've done work in prisons and jails and in the community. And I've also, because I go to a lot of events, I hear what's going on in places all around the country, and I work with about 28 different colleagues at different places around the country. And so I really think the first step for many communities in addressing the problem of having a lot of children with incarcerated parents in their communities is some kind of systematic data collection that usually starts with corrections. And so it's finding out, you know, how many people in their facility are parents, what are the ages of their children, what are their needs. And a lot of different states have had systematic data collection required by the state legislature. So California, Washington, Oregon, Arkansas, other places, they actually have gone that far that they require it. Then I think it's really important to have systems of service and programs both on the inside and the outside. And sometimes people say, oh, well, if a parent's in jail, you can't do a whole lot because they might be there for such a brief time. But there are ways to reach out and connect them with community services. In addition, you know, some people do spend up to a year in jail, so it's not that everybody's cycling through. And there have been some studies. So Allegheny County in Pennsylvania did an extensive study of their jail population and a follow-up study, and they found that there were a lot of needs that they could actually try to help meet. I just was in Cleveland, and they're doing a major community engagement effort because they have so many children with incarcerated parents, and their county is responsible for sending like 25 to 30% of the people who are in the state prison there. So it's pretty extreme. And they're trying things, you know, integrating with Big Brothers, Big Sisters, the Boys and Girls Club, Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. These places all have programs for children with incarcerated parents, and they just need to activate it and make use of it. There's also some really great programs besides mentoring, such as filmmaking and support groups. There's also recommendations from the Adverse Childhood Experience study that came out from the Center for Disease Control about making home environments really positive for children, and that would absolutely hold for this population. And that's on here. It's just a link to a PDF, but you know, I can get you that information. We also recommend places moving toward more child-friendly visitation, and that is, if possible, allowing children more privacy, if possible, allowing them to have face-to-face contact with the parent. It's not always possible, but trying to make it as comfortable for children as possible. And I commend Sauk on this because of all the places that we observed in Wisconsin and Minnesota. I thought that the friendliest staff were here at Sauk County, and there were some coloring materials and things out for the kids, and I thought a couple of times when I came here that there were some really positive interactions between a female staff member and the kids that I was so pleased to see, because at some of these other facilities we never observed even one positive interaction between a corrections officer and children. Children were seen as a pain. Also, of course, alternatives to incarceration is really critical, and I know that you know, at the national level there's some movement on this issue for first-time drug offenders and trying to think of alternatives to incarceration. Actually, the U.S. is sort of behind all the other countries in the world on this issue. The U.S. incarcerates more people than any other country, and 1 in 28 children in the United States has a parent behind bars, which is absolutely ridiculous. It's so many times higher than any country in the world. Here's an example of a filmmaking program. It's called Echoes of Incarceration. Young people made films about their experiences, and they were invited to the White House. There's Valerie Jarrett, senior advisor to the president. She'd just gotten off out of a meeting with him. They were talking about the Ebola crisis. And on the right is Miss America from Kenosha. She's the Miss America from 2012, and she had an incarcerated parent. She goes around advocating for young kids who have an incarcerated parent because she knows that it's very stigmatizing, and part of how you get over something that's difficult is talking about something that's difficult. Other examples, so you know, I don't I don't know everything that's going on in Sauk County, but for example, in Madison, Big Brothers Big Sisters and Madison Area Urban Ministry have a mentoring program, and these are also to be found all over the place. There are summer camps and after-school programs available for kids with incarcerated parents. For example, Children of Promise is a program in New York City. There's Girl Scouts Beyond Bars, which is a great program that the Girl Scouts offer for girls with incarcerated moms. I mentioned filmmaking, and now there's a federal working group on children of incarcerated parents that involves 22 federal agencies, and they meet on a monthly basis to discuss things, and they have a website now and great information for people who are more interested in this topic, and some resources that are available for training and for helping the young kids. I also have some suggestions for professionals, including just awareness of how many children are affected, and knowing that if you know a child who has or had in the past an incarcerated parent, giving them the message that they are not alone. This is actually a common problem in our country, and just because someone is incarcerated and was a, quote, bad citizen, they broke a law, doesn't necessarily equal that they are a bad parent. There are plenty of incarcerated parents that actually were good parents when they were on the outside, and they still try to be good parents when they're on the inside. And some people say, well, oh my gosh, how can you be recommending that they stay in contact with their incarcerated parent? What if the parent isn't getting out until after the kid's 18? Well, I would ask all of you to think of, do you have any relatives that you hardly ever see that are important to you, or that you occasionally send cards to or talk to? Yes, of course, we all do. I have a godmother who lives in Florida, or I've only probably seen a handful of times in my whole life, but she's really important to me. I also, people say to me like, oh, you really would recommend contact between a child and the parent if the parent is like a violent offender, like a murderer? Well, it all depends, because if the parent had, hurt the child or the siblings, probably not. But that's rare, that's relatively rare. Most violent crimes are not committed against children. And so yes, even a murderer could be a good parent. Maybe I'm shocking you by saying that, but it's true. And this is based on actual observations of children and research, not just our predetermined notions. So I think in ways we can combat stereotypes and stigma. We can try to be more welcoming to these children and their families. We can support caregivers in their role and recognize the important work they do and the challenge they experience economically and socially. And then we can also encourage kids to play out their concerns, while not traumatizing other people. So if you work in a Head Start or an early childhood center, I've heard of kids where, the kids are playing cops and robbers, and the kid with the incarcerated parent is like, well, instead of arresting the person, let's try to break them out of jail, and the adults are like, oh my gosh, but if you're sensitive, you can deal with these things, and it doesn't have to be like a major trauma every time if you think of a child-centric perspective. I also think it's really important to share resources, and that's why Sesame Street printed up millions of these with the funding that they received. And we use them not just for little children. We a lot of times give them to older children and say, hey, could you critique this? I want to know what's good and bad about it. So then they look at it and they get the messages without them feeling like you're babying them. But it's actually really good. The Sesame Street created Muppet, this little guy with blue hair. His name is Alex, and he has an incarcerated dad. And the thing about kids is they think Muppets are kids. And so when the Muppet talks, they think the kid is talking. But the cool thing is we can script what the Muppet says, so it's really an adult talking. So it's kind of cool, sneaky way of getting to kids, but kids love it. On the DVD, there's some information, there's like videos. The best ones, I think, are the ones that involve Muppets and people supporting Alex the Muppet around this issue, and they talk about things like, you're not alone, it's not your fault. It's okay to have big feelings about it. Make sure you talk to adults in your life. Don't worry if someone says to you, you're going to end up just like your dad, you're going to end up in prison too. Don't worry about it. We end up like our parents in some ways, but not in others. We can help kids make better choices than their parents, and it takes a village. So there's also a beautiful song in here called You Are Not Alone. It was written by the composer of the Wicked musical. It's lovely. There's also a storybook for children. And these things are also available as an app, a free app, if you just go to, I don't know, iTunes or whatever it is, and you just type in Sesame Street incarceration, you get it. And you can have it on a tablet or a phone or a computer. And then it's also available online for free. So I would encourage people to share those kinds of resources. I also think it's important to support a family's choice about positive contact with between children and their incarcerated parents. I did write a paper with some of my colleagues to the United Nations a couple of years ago. They had a worldwide theme of children of incarcerated parents. They pick the Committee on the Rights of the Young Child picks a theme every year, and that was their theme. And so we wrote a paper on what is child-friendly visitation. It includes these elements. There has to be open communication. Professionals have to be supportive. You prepare the children for visits. And one of the things on this video is an animated visit, an animation of a child's visit to a father who's incarcerated, and it's lovely, and it helps prepare children. And right now we're doing a randomized controlled trial study to evaluate the materials and how they affect children's visits. And so far what we've seen is really positive stuff. We give kids an iPad and they watch and listen to it before the visit, and what we've seen is, you know, the caregiver's looking over their shoulder and like hugging the child, and you know, there's like warm fuzzy feelings, and it's good. So anyway, there's me with the Muppets. Oh, and I guess I would say, Muppets always make you look good. Standing by Miss America does not. So I took my chances, but I also edited a book called Children of Incarcerated Parents. It was the first handbook in the field, and I believe I distributed some copies to UW Extension and the law enforcement center here, but they've sold out, so we've been asked to create a second edition, so we're in the process of that. But you still can get chapters online. I've also developed fact sheets with UW Extension, and they've been translated and used by Wisconsin Public Television and lots of other things, and they're still free online, and they help people about child development issues. I think that's really important. And I just wanted to leave some time for questions, so special thanks to people in my lab, my funding sources, the corrections partners, UW Extension, and the people who work here, including Mary Huser, who's the state specialist. And so thank you so much for your attention on this issue. I'm happy to answer questions. So you had a question?
A comment and a question. The comment